Look, and thanks very much to the comrades in CLS with whom I've been working for a long time, and it's quite nice, pleasant, is to feel, you know the way it is to feel good among comrades that are actually in the same legions, battling against the same enemies. So that's good. Venezuela has been, the Venezuelan government, the Bolivarian government has been the subject of US aggression from 1998, when Hugo Chavez was elected. I won't go into all the details of the whole history, but it's more than 20 years of systematic and persistent US aggression with the aim of overthrowing the government by any means, whether it is by a coup d'etat, by military intervention, or anything else. They've been trying everything. Because Venezuela was so strong between 1998 and all the way to 2013, 2012, 13, 14, because of the export of oil, which makes the United States vulnerable to the possibility that Chavez would, close the tap of oil to the US economy, and the US economy cannot function without oil. That gave a sort of leverage in the hands of Chavez for him to be able to sustain the pressure and use the huge revenues that the oil exports were generating to the economy and distributed it very equally among the population, and thereby producing enormous social progress in a society that by 1998 had something like between 70 to 80% level of poverty. That was the level of poverty at the time. And the reason is structural. The Venezuelan economy in 1998 got about 85, 90% of its revenues from the oil industry. But the industry itself generated only 3% of the employment in the domestic economy. So you can imagine this is a massive distortion. That is to say, a very small proportion of the population, which was the elite that was supposedly administering the oil, and what I would call a labor bureaucracy, the people who were working in the oil industry, which was a very small proportion of the whole potential or actual working class, really benefited out of this. This section of the working class had some trade unions, they were well organized, they got privileges and so on, but the rest of society, excuse my language, could basically go to hell, which is what the elite did with them. That's why you have a country which was, in terms of indexes, in terms of GDP and so on, was quite well off, comparatively speaking, with many other societies. But at the same time, it suffered from these extraordinary domestic malaises, such as massive marginalization, massive social exclusion and political exclusion, massive unemployment, massive levels of informality, and of course, massive levels of poverty. Chavez used the oil revenue deliberately and openly, explicitly, in order to rectify all of this, and managed pretty well. By 2010, 11, the level of poverty in Venezuela has come down to something like 26, 27%, from about 80, which is enormous. And we are talking about 1998 to 2010, we're talking about something like 12 years, perhaps 13 years. So in a very short period of time, people began to feel immediately the benefits of the new policies. The problem for Venezuela, the curse and the blessing at the same time, was the fact that it was one of the main producers of oil in the world. And it has the largest deposit of oil in the world. And that is the reason. There is no other reason. That is the real strategic reason as to why the United States is desperate to try to get rid of this government. Let me put it differently. I think I've explained this to the group already, but just in case, I understand there are new members and new people, which is excellent. To get oil from the Middle East to the United States through tankers, which is the way it's done, it takes between 40 to 45 days, with all the risks associated with it. And the oil from Venezuela takes about 4 days. So just the very fact of that reality is an indication of why the United States want to get that oil. And as a result of the wars of the United States against Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so on, but particularly Iraq, which I think it was the trigger of the economic problem that the United States began to face ever since. The price of oil started to go up quite dramatically. In 1998, when Chavez took office, the barrel of oil was $7, $8 in the world market, $7, $8 the barrel. The moment Chavez took over, immediately strengthened OPEC in order to coordinate with other oil-producing countries so as to ensure that the output that was going into the world market was controlled so that the level of price could be maintained reasonably high. On the one hand, not to harm the Western economies, but at the same time, making sure that the oil-producing economies benefited out of this. Because if you produce a glut in the oil market, all you do is reduce the price of oil quite dramatically. Oil-producing countries do not benefit at all, and you end up subsidizing the US economy massively, which is what was being done before Chavez came to office. So the moment Chavez strengthened OPEC, the price of oil went up from $7, $8 the barrel to something like 22. But the war in Iraq particularly pushed it to as high as $150 the barrel. So you can imagine, all of a sudden, this nation is getting huge amounts of resources. And Venezuela in the good times, before the crisis and before the sanctions and before the horrible aggression, Venezuela was producing something like 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. So what came to the nation was gigantic in terms of resources, gigantic. And there is an important point I want to make before coming into the more contemporary situation. Venezuela, the leadership of the Bolivarian revolution, could have used those resources to industrialize their own country, to improve the infrastructure much more than Chavez did, and so forth. But they used a huge amount of those resources that came into the economy to help other countries in the region. They were essential. Venezuela was central in ensuring that Argentina and Brazil were able to actually pay up the external debt that was asphyxiating them. And it was through Venezuelan bonds in the stock exchange internationally. That's what did it. And the total amounts that were paid between Brazil and Argentina alone was in the region at the time, we're talking about 2005, 6, 7, 8, in the region of $24 billion. This money could have been spent in Venezuela, but what they did, they decided to use the resources to help their brothers and sisters in the rest of the continent. Then there was the question of Petrocaribe, which obviously everybody knows, and that also was a cost to Venezuela. Then there was the Operation Miracle jointly with Cuba, which identified people who were blind because of cataracts and similar eye ailments that were flown from wherever they were into Venezuela or Cuba free of charge, when somebody who accompanied the patient in order to get an operation that restored their eyesight, and then the convalescence would be paid off by the Venezuelan government, and then the flying back would also be paid by them. So between the moment when the Operation Miracle was launched And the moment when it had to stop, Venezuela and Cuba carried out something like 5 million such operations, through the whole continent, which is absolutely extraordinary. I remember at the time, Cuba and Venezuela, Chavez and Castro and Fidel were discussing the possibility of extending this program, the same program, to Africa. And their calculation was in something like 5 to 10 years, if they were able to expand things, they would be able to operate and restore the eyesight to something like 10 million Africans just to start with. That was the plan. Unfortunately, the world economic crisis in 2008 hit the whole continent in Latin America. The less strong economies, as the consequences was that they couldn't expand into Africa and have to virtually stop the thing. So that gives you an idea of why the United States not only wanted the oil, but also this is the threat of a good example. Imagine if other countries, and this actually happened, other countries began to be contaminated, let me use that expression, to be contaminated by the example of Venezuela. And then there was Bolivia. Many countries actually moved to the left quite dramatically and began to apply similar policies. So this was completely intolerable for the United States and its European accomplices and the domestic reactionaries in Latin America itself. And they tried every possible means to either assassinate or invade and so on. And the chance presented itself from 2008 all the way up to now. The world economic crisis brought about by capitalism itself, allowed the United States and its accomplices to capitalize on the problems that the credit crunch was going to bring about to our economies in Latin America. And this applies to Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, you name it. And the reason is our economies are very heavily dependent on the export of commodities, the exportation of commodities. So when the world economy, as a result of a crisis brought about by Wall Street or something like that, then the world economy contracts and there is less demand of what we want. So it produces a double effect. On the one hand, we're able to sell much less than we were selling before as a consequence of, the Western economies demanding less of what we produce. But at the same time, because of the contraction, the prices goes down. So it's a double whammy. It's not just the decline in demand, but it's also the decline in price. So imagine you might be facing a situation where you are buoyant because you are selling your oil at $150 the barrel. And then in 2 years, maybe in 6 months, suddenly the world has stopped demanding the same amount and you are selling 500,000 barrels at something like $20 the barrel, which is more or less what happened to Venezuela. So suddenly all the social program that you were implementing comes to a halt. And as a consequence, the United States organizes all sorts of intervention inside your economy through NGOs, all sorts of funding of funny organizations of every imaginable description in order to create the conditions for regime change. Destabilization, violence, we have seen it in Nicaragua, we have seen it now in Cuba, we have seen it in Venezuela many times, we have seen it in Bolivia, and you name it, we have seen it. And every single time, when you trace what is the origins of this, how is it funded, you end up in Washington, DC, in the United States, every time, absolutely every single time. The two key organizations, I don't have too much time to go into that unless there are questions later on. One is the two key organizations are USAID and then the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. These are the two key institutions that are central to the regime change US machinery, which it is deployed absolutely every time. Just to give you an idea, in the case of Cuba, in the recent attempt of destabilization, in the previous 2 years, the United States, USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy had financed, of what we know, what is public, is 54 groups, of sort of so-called NGOs. And the United States, in something like 2 years, in order to fund these groups, had disbursed $40 million. If you think how much the dollar weighs in an economy such as Cuba, that gives you an idea of how, the power that the United States has to intervene, especially destabilize our countries, especially when we're going through some economic difficulties. So what extraordinary, in my view, is that once Chavez died in 2013, the United States thought that the opportunity had finally arrived for them to topple these governments once and for all. But to their surprise, including my surprise, pleasant surprise in my case, they couldn't. They didn't manage to. Nicolas Maduro replaced Hugo Chavez, was elected, and then was re-elected in 2018. And ever since, he's been facing a very aggressive regime of sanctions applied by the United States, aimed at suffocating, asphyxiating the Venezuelan economy totally to the point of making it collapse. And this is explicit. This is not what it's not my conclusion. This is what they say openly when they implement these things. From the moment Donald Trump came to the White House to now, the United States has implemented 431 economic sanctions against Venezuela, which covers absolutely every imaginable range of the economy. You name it, it is covered. 431. And this information is public. If you go to the website of the US State Department, you will find the details there. And they boast about having implemented this, having imposed this. This is incredible. 431. Just to cut a long story short, by 2014, approximately, Venezuela was receiving, say, a certain amount of revenues from the world economy, which would have been quite reasonable, which would allow them to operate everything they had, the social program, their expenditure, their commitments to their friends and brothers and sisters in the rest of the continent, and so on, without any major problem. By 2017, Venezuela was receiving 1% of that total in 2014. That is to say, the revenue that was accruing to Venezuela declined by 99% as a consequence of the sanctions that were implemented by or inflicted by Donald Trump against Venezuela in a period of 2 years. Between 2017 and 2017, 40,000 people died unnecessarily as a consequence of Venezuela being unable to find medicine, being unable to find enough food, being unable to have enough, health input to actually look after this population. And that's why the most vulnerable, the chronically ill, the young pregnant women and so on died as a consequence. 40,000 between 2017 and 2018 alone in 1 year. But ever since, because the regime of sanctions has been intensified, then nobody has the actual figures, but possibly in the region of 150 to 200,000 people have died unnecessarily. That gives you an idea of what the United States, the murderous criminal activity of the United States, the aggression against Venezuela. This was not good enough because Venezuela continued to resist, despite, hanging from a thread. They continued to fight back, and the people of Venezuela continued to resist. So what they decided to do was to go for something more dramatic. In 2018, in August, there's no question about it, in my view, the United States was centrally involved. They sent a drone with explosives during the military parade, which is quite public, where the high military command and the high political command of the Venezuelan revolution was in the stage. And these drones were made explode prematurely by the security forces in Venezuela itself. But had they exploded in the stage where Maduro and the high command was, watching the military parade, these explosives would have decapitated the high command of the revolution, which was the intention. That is one. Then in February 2019, they tried to force food. This was the excuse that the Maduro government doesn't want to accept international food to its own population, and therefore the United States with Colombia and the extreme right wing in Venezuela organized a push to try to get through food into Venezuelan territory through military means, with the support of the Colombian military, Colombian paramilitaries, and God knows what else. The Venezuelans were able to resist it and defeat this. This was on the back of a so-called Live Aid concert organized partly by somebody called Richard Branson, who you may have heard of. He was supposed to be the compare. That was extraordinary. The intention was to get in, occupy a territory, proclaim a provisional government, and then call on the international community, namely the United States, to help them out militarily. In other words, it was a provocation to actually organize and justify an external extension, an external military intervention. Then what they did was to organize a mercenary attack from Colombia, which was, the intention was, and this was heavily publicized internationally in all sorts of media, that the intention was to arrive to the country by the sea and then move to the presidential palace, assassinate Maduro or kidnap him, and then assassinate as many people in the high command as possible. And then from there on, they will overthrow the government, install Juan Guaido as the president, and then Juan Guaido will call into the international community for support. This was defeated as well. Then there was an attack on the electricity system of Venezuela through a cyber attack, which blacked out the country completely. The idea was to cause confusion, chaos, in order to create a sort of context of civil war kind of situation, again, with the whole intention of justifying an external military intervention. And not content with all of that, the United States then using Guaido, I would say weaponizing Guaido, who proclaimed himself interim president of the country and was recognized by the European Union, certainly by the United Kingdom government, as the real, genuine president who never been elected by anybody. Using Guaido in his capacity as interim president, self-proclaimed, then the United States weaponized him and began to confiscate all the assets that Venezuela had in the United States, which include, an oil distribution, gasoline distribution company in the East Coast, plus many other, current accounts, bank accounts, anything you want. And the total amount that this involves is in the region of $60 billion. Just to give you an idea of what this means, the GDP of Nicaragua is in the region of $20 billion. That is to say, just with one blow, the United States, using the extreme right wing, took away the equivalent of 3 GDPs of a country such as Nicaragua from Venezuela in less than 2 weeks. Then they confiscated property that belonged to Venezuela in Colombia. Then they froze all the assets that Venezuela had in Europe, including 31 tons of gold in the Bank of England, as everybody knows. So that gives you a picture, an idea of where we are, of what was inflicted on the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan nation. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. Quite frankly, I think it's miraculous, the fact that they were able to do it. Nevertheless, despite all of that, I have good news. We have survived. The Venezuelan government has survived, the Venezuelan process has survived, and now they become very, very strengthened. This is fantastic. This is unbelievable, but it's very good indeed, because it gives hopes to everybody else. Now, what they've done is this. Number one, they resisted carefully, using their resources very wisely, making sure that they apply socialist policies as much as possible to ensure that, you know, they took care of the whole population, particularly the most vulnerable. And that gives you an idea, because Venezuela is one of the countries that have one of the lowest incidences of COVID, and even lower incidence of people who died as a consequence of COVID. It's really small compared to, say, other countries with similar levels. The three countries with the lowest levels of COVID contagion and COVID death in Latin America are Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. Everybody else is a little bit of a disaster. You know, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, you name it, they're pretty bad. So Venezuela survived, but not only that, Maduro insisted again and again and again, fastidiously, that what he wanted to do was to actually enter into a dialogue with the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, so that through political means and through dialogue, they were able to actually come together and resolve, address jointly the problems of the nation. And he insisted again. As far as I'm aware, and as far as they report themselves, since 2016, 17 approximately, Maduro may have made something like more than 1,000 calls for dialogue with the opposition, and eventually paid off. One section of the opposition, realizing that Guaido was being defeated and was being crushed, and you know, Guaido has been crushed. One of the manifestations of the crushing politically of Juan Guaido is the fact that the European Union, realizing that the Bolivarian government was not going to be overthrown, they decided to withdraw their recognition of Guaido as interim president. In other words, Maduro is the president they recognize. That was big. It wasn't in the news, of course. Nevertheless, we understood, and the Venezuelans obviously understood, and everybody else who knows what diplomacy and politics is about understood that this was a big deal. And that was a very significant, you know, I think quite a significant development that was a manifestation of the strength of the resistance and the politics of no capitulation by the Maduro government against the pressure of imperialism, and also the proposal that came from all over the place. That was clear indication. And number two, the sections of opposition began to split all over the place. And what was created was several currents that entered into dialogue with President Maduro to see how they can address the thing. And this was helped quite massively by the sponsorship of Mexico, who offered Mexico, you know, the current left-wing president, Manuel Lopez Obrador, who said, you can have the conversations here. And Mexican government hosted the conversations. There have been 3 sessions of these dialogues. Each one of them has produced very interesting results. I can elaborate on some of them for questions of time. The rest are just normal agreements. But what was interesting is that they decided to participate in the national elections that are going to take place on the 21st of November, which will renew various authorities, parliamentarians, as well as municipalities and governors, you know, which is quite an important election in Venezuela. And Guaido was left out. He complained bitterly, internationally, publicly, to say, I've been excluded. This is not democratic. I remember, you know, he made it sort of crime, more or less. And Maduro said, oh, no. He said, you are totally included, but there are 3 conditions in your case. And this is condition we impose on anybody. The preconditions are the following. Number 1, we want people to reject and condemn all the aggression all the sanctions imposed by the United States on the people and the nation of Venezuela, and we want them to be, and we want you to demand that they lift them immediately. That's number one precondition. That's a nationalist thing. You don't have to agree with me politically in order to agree with that measure. That's number one. Number two, you have to agree not to use violence or any illegal or unconstitutional means to try to change the government. The only way to change the government in Venezuela is by means of elections when they take place. And number three, we want you to recognize the existing institutionality of Venezuela. We want you to recognize the presidency, we want you to recognize the National Assembly, we want you to recognize, the Supreme Court and everything. Is the reason for this demand is because the opposition led by the United States began to set up parallel bodies all over the place. Some of them were in Europe, some of them were in Colombia, and so on, with the idea to try to undermine the legitimacy and the operationality of the existing institutions in Venezuela. So Maduro said, you can participate, absolutely no problem, provided that you accept these three conditions, which everybody else in the dialogue has accepted, which is amazing. So what we have now is that Guaido, this is my sense, requested advice and direction from Washington. Washington is a bit startled with this level of success by President Maduro, and I think they realize they cannot continue doing the same, of course, because it doesn't work, but they don't know exactly what new to do because they're a bit in trouble. So therefore, they didn't give advice. So Guaido decided not to recognize, not to accept these three conditions with everybody else has accepted. And this is extremely important. And now even better, or even better, as they say in London. And now we've seen the extraordinary development, which has taken, it's been announced only a couple of days ever since, a couple of days ago, I think, which is the European Union has decided to send an observer mission to the elections in Venezuela in agreement with the National Electoral Council and with the government of Venezuela, with the authorities of Venezuela, which is the only conditions under which Venezuela will accept them. So it looks like, and I don't want to prejudge or predict too much, but it looks like the elections are going to take place under very much a huge amount of normality. Guaido has excluded himself by not accepting the minimum, democratic conditions to participate in the elections, which is totally reasonable. At any rate, Guaido and company are extremely weakened and debilitated by their own politics, and they're not popular at all in Venezuela. This group used to represent parties that scored substantial percentages in elections, not anymore. Now they are completely discredited everywhere, anywhere, certainly in Venezuela. They tried to organize mobilizations, and I'm not exaggerating, they were able to mobilize 200 people. So that gives you an idea of how bad it is. And the rest of the opposition, which are various currents in the right, who are participating in this agreement, they expect to score some gains in these elections that are coming up on the 21st of November. So given that the elections are going to take place in conditions of normality, and given the existing current polls, it looks like the Chavistas are going to be pretty successful or reasonably successful, which is what they want. This will lead to the normalization of the situation in Venezuela, and if the European Union, which is likely to do, especially after their fiasco in Bolivia, which blew in their faces. Now they realize they cannot play games like that anymore, because otherwise they're excluded from the markets in Latin America. So it looks like the European Union are going to recognize the result of the election, which means that the United States is going to be totally isolated. So the potential is enormous. Just one couple of sentences, if I may, comrades, regarding the international, the regional context, which I want to sort of only enunciate rather than detail. the relation of forces in the region have changed quite dramatically in our favor, very, very dramatically. I don't want to exaggerate the point. Obviously, there are threats and problems, and every time we go for something, it's always bumpy, problematical in Latin America, but nevertheless, we're still moving forward. We made substantial gains by the election of the left-wing president in Mexico, which has changed the relation of forces quite dramatically. The left wing has come back to Argentina, into the presidency, which is another big country. Bolivia was able to recover their democracy by defeating the fascists and the racists, and now President Luis Arce is there. We have a constitutional process which is going to promulgate a new constitution in Chile, whose job is to bury neoliberalism in that nation. That is explicitly the task that the new Constitutional Assembly has. And then in Peru, a rural primary school teacher, Pedro Castillo, has been elected to the presidency, changing massively the relation of forces in the region. We are going to have elections in Nicaragua on the 7th of November, and the FSLN, the Sandinista Liberation Front, are going to win hands down. I'm absolutely certain of that. There is no problem with that, except the media is going to, have a field day with that, but who cares? I certainly don't, because what matters is what the people of Nicaragua decides, as a sovereign. And then there will be elections in Honduras, and people I know in Honduras confirmed to me that the elections are very likely going to produce a left-wing result in Honduras, which would be extraordinary. We'll see. Certainly Honduras is more difficult because the right wing is more brutal. So this means that we're moving towards the next year, and I'll finish with this. And the crucial election next year in October 2022 are going to be the elections in Brazil. And it looks like Jair Bolsonaro is in real trouble, and Lula is going up in the ascendancy in the region. So we have, a context which is extremely conducive for us coming back together. And we're already coming back together, through the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean states, whose summit was in Mexico recently. And they agree on many positive things, the continuation of what Chavez began some time ago. So from that position, I think we are in a position to continue with the process of building a new world and challenge successfully the Yanks in the North, because the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean states, which organizes all the governments in the region, explicitly excludes Canada and the United States. So what is being played out in Venezuela is extremely important. So we're going to be calling on you, comrades, to help us out with every solidarity you can provide for this very important world factor, which is Venezuela. We are in the vanguard, and we want to change not just Venezuela, not just Latin America, the whole world. Thank you, comrades.